So you'll remember at the beginning of the course, we talked a lot about variable and fixed overhead. Variable overhead was things that change with the level of production. So the materials you're buying to produce units of products, that's going to change depending on your level of production. And then we talked about fixed overhead, such things as depreciation of property, plant, and equipment, or property taxes, rent, things that aren't going to change depending on the level of production. So, as we examine these, both of those categories can have standards that we measure against. And so, for variable overhead, we measure against spending and efficiency, and fixed overhead, we measure against spending and volume of production. So, by breaking down the variable overhead variance into spending and efficiency, managers can get a better understanding of where exactly the variance is coming from so they can perform an investigation if the variance is outside the control tolerance level. So on the spending side of things, is our cost per unit more or less than we expected? Or on the efficiency side of it, are we taking more or less hours to produce that unit than we expected it would? And when we're looking at these variances, it's similar to any other variance. For the variable overhead spending variance, we're looking at the difference between what the standard was and what it actually came out to be. And so, as the name implies, with variable overhead, we know that variable overhead increases or decreases based on level of production. So we also assume that variable overhead should vary in proportion to changes in the direct labor hours used. That is, we use more labor to produce more units. We should use less labor if we're producing less units. If we're using more hours than expected, that's said to be inefficient. If we're using less hours than expected or using the number of hours that are expected, that's said to be efficient. When we're looking at materials and labor, those are very specific inputs. If we're producing a unit of material, we know exactly what's going in to producing it. We know exactly, or we can know exactly, how long it takes us to produce that. Those are very concrete numbers. Overhead, by its very nature, is not concrete. It varies for a number of reasons. So, like in our humble pies case, for example, we knew that the materials and labor for each different variety of pie varied significantly in some cases. But in terms of the factory as a whole, the variable overhead rate was constant. So since so many different factors go into variable overhead, the rate represents the weighted cost per direct labor hour that should be incurred for all variable overhead items. Looking at variable overhead in terms of labor, if labor was more than expected, it's going to cost us more. If it's less than expected, it's going to cost us less. And that's directly tied to employees physically working. In terms of materials, overhead spending may go up or down depending on the price of materials. So you think about if you're a trucking company, gasoline, gas rises and falls almost on a daily basis. Another reason that variable overhead might fluctuate is because of waste or inefficiency in production. If you're not using all of the raw materials you purchased in production and you have a lot of scrap, or you have a lot of errors in production and you need to dispose of materials for that reason, that causes your variable overhead costs to rise. And again, if this causes a material effect on your financials and it's outside the control tolerance, you're going to want to investigate the source of that leakage. Variance in terms of materials happens when prices fluctuate. As I gave the example before, a trucking company buying gas, management doesn't control the cost of gas, so those costs have to be factored. You might be able to figure out how to use less gas, but by and large, this is something that's out of your control. So those fluctuations need to be priced into variable overhead. When looking at variable overhead in terms of labor, as we said before, if we use more labor than expected, that's inefficient. If we use less than expected, that's efficient. And we should see the costs changing in proportion to the changes in direct labor hours. If we're producing more product, we're buying more raw materials, and it should be taking us longer to produce them. You'll remember when we talked about fixed overhead costs, and we said that they're related largely to assets of the company, depreciating property, plant, and equipment, paying leases due on capital equipment or property that the company owns, or property taxes related to that. So all of these costs occur before we actually use them. Like in variable overhead, we're buying raw materials, we're going to produce the products. With fixed overhead, we acquire the building, and then at some point in the future, we're going to be in production of products. You'll notice here that they say the fixed overhead rate changes as the underlying production level changes. That sounds a lot like variable overhead. Remember, we had said that fixed costs remain fixed regardless of the level of production. So what's happening here? Well, in this case, the fixed overhead rate is based on levels of production, meaning we're taking all of the fixed costs of the company and basically dividing it by the level of production to come up with a fixed overhead rate per unit. So as the levels of production change, so does the fixed overhead then.